In space, no one can hear you scream. Welcome to our exploration of the history of horror cinema. As we trace back the tendrils of terror that have permeated through our screens, we find ourselves in the silent film era, where horror truly found its footing. This is where the primal roots of our cinematic fears began. With no voices to carry the terror, these films relied on atmospheric visuals and the raw emotions of the actors to send chills down the viewer's spines. Consider the haunting figure of Nosferatu, a name that echoes through the annals of horror history. This silent German expressionist film from the early 20s, directed by F.W. Murnau, introduced audiences to the terrifying Count Orlok. A vampire in all but name, Orlok's grotesque appearance and eerie movements became a template for future creature features. And then we have The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, another German expressionist masterpiece. Directed by Robert Wiene, this film is often considered the first true horror film. With its twisted visuals and chilling narrative, it introduced the world to the concept of psychological horror. These films, and others like them, set the foundation for the genre. They taught us that horror isn't just about the monsters that lurk in the dark, but the fear that resides within us. They showed us that sometimes silence can be more terrifying than any scream. And so, as we walked through the shadowy corridors of these silent classics, we arrived at a turning point. The silent era was ending, and horror was about to find its voice. It was a voice that would echo throughout the decades, evolving and adapting to the changing times, but always remaining true to its roots. We'll delve deeper into this evolution in the coming scenes: the golden age of Hollywood, the atomic age monsters, the slasher films and body horrors, the meta-horror and found footage era, and finally, the modern horror and its future. But for now, let's take a moment to appreciate the silent beginnings of horror cinema. For it was in these silent films that horror found its true essence. As we moved out of the silent film era, horror found its voice, and it was a scream. The 1930s and 40s, an era of silver screens and chilling screams. Welcome to the golden age of Hollywood horror, where monster movies reigned supreme and the silver screen was drenched in shadowy thrills. This era marked the rise of the Universal Monsters, a collection of characters that would become as iconic as the studio that birthed them. These were no ordinary beasts. They were manifestations of our deepest fears and darkest nightmares, brought to life with stunning makeup and special effects that still hold up today. First, there was Dracula, the Transylvanian count with a thirst for blood, brought to terrifying life by Bela Lugosi in 1931. His haunting performance, with his hypnotic gaze and chilling accent, set the standard for vampire portrayals for generations to come. Then came Frankenstein, a grotesque creation stitched together from the parts of the dead, a tragic figure brought to life by Boris Karloff. The film not only delivered chills and thrills, but also posed profound questions about the nature of life and the dangers of playing God. And let's not forget the Wolfman, a tragic hero cursed to transform into a beast under the full moon. Lon Chaney Jr.'s tortured performance added a layer of pathos to the horror, making the film as much a tragedy as it was a terror tale. These films, and others like them, brought horror into the mainstream. They were not just about jump scares and cheap thrills. They were about exploring the human condition, our fears, our desires, our capacity for good and evil. They were horror with a heart, and they left an indelible mark on the genre. But as the world changed, so did horror. The monsters of the Golden Age began to lose their grip on the public's imagination, replaced by new fears and anxieties. The atomic age was dawning, and with it, a new era of horror. But as the world changed, so did horror, taking us into the atomic age. In the 1950s and 60s, horror reflected our deepest fears and anxieties. As the world stood on the brink of nuclear warfare, the horror cinema landscape mirrored these terror-filled times. The atomic age was upon us, and with it came a whole new breed of monster movies. No longer were audiences merely frightened by supernatural creatures and gothic horrors. Now, they were confronted with monstrosities born from mankind's own destructive capabilities. Giant irradiated creatures like those in Them and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms embodied society's growing unease about the potential fallout from nuclear experimentation. These films served as a stark reminder of the horrors that unchecked scientific advancements could unleash on an unsuspecting world. But it wasn't just oversized critters that had audiences clutching their popcorn in terror. The 1950s and 60s also saw the rise of psychological horror, a subgenre that delved into the darkest corners of the human mind. This was a time when filmmakers began to explore the concept that the most terrifying monsters might not be lurking in the shadows, but within us. Take, for instance, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, a film that forever changed the horror genre. With its shocking narrative twists and chilling character study of Norman Bates, Psycho demonstrated just how terrifying the human psyche could be. It was a fear that was more subtle, yet infinitely more insidious. Then there was The Birds, another Hitchcock masterpiece, which took a common, everyday occurrence, birds flying in the sky, and transformed it into a horrifying spectacle. It was a perfect example of how psychological horror could take the mundane and make it terrifying, playing on our deepest, darkest fears. These films, and others like them, marked a turning point in horror cinema. They dared to tread where few had ventured before, exploring the terrifying possibilities of the atomic age and the terrifying depths of the human mind. The 70s and 80s brought a new wave of horror, with films that were not for the faint of heart. But more on that in the next scene. For now, let's take a moment to appreciate the chilling brilliance of the atomic age monsters and psychological horrors that forever changed the face of horror cinema. Welcome to the era of slashers and body horrors. This is where horror took a sharp turn into the realm of the visceral and the terrifyingly personal. As we moved into the late 60s and 70s, societal anxieties began to seep into our cinema, and horror was no exception. Directors began to push the boundaries of what was acceptable, and as a result, we saw the birth of a new subgenre: slasher films. Slasher films, with their relentless murderers and vulnerable victims, struck a nerve in the collective consciousness. Films like John Carpenter's Halloween introduced us to the concept of the unstoppable killer, a figure that embodied our deepest fears and anxieties. In the face of such an implacable foe, the traditional heroes and heroines of cinema seemed helpless, amplifying the sense of dread and suspense. But it wasn't just the slashers that were pushing the envelope. The 70s also saw the rise of body horrors, a subgenre that took the fear of the unknown and made it disturbingly physical. Movies like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre brought the horror home in a very literal sense, with its terrifying depiction of cannibalism and slaughter. And then, of course, there was The Exorcist. This film took the concept of body horror to a whole new level, with its graphic depiction of demonic possession and exorcism. It played on our fears of the supernatural, of losing control of our own bodies, and of the evil that lurks within us all. These films, with their graphic violence and shocking themes, were not just designed to scare us. They were a reflection of the times, a mirror held up to society's darkest fears and anxieties. They pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in cinema, and in doing so, they redefined the genre of horror. But as we moved into the 90s, horror began to play with our expectations. The genre wasn't done evolving, and as we'll see in the next scene, it was about to take another unexpected turn. In the 90s and the new millennium, horror got self-aware. It was a time when the genre decided to look at itself in the mirror, and the reflection was chilling. The emergence of meta-horror and found footage films marked a significant shift in the horror landscape. Meta-horror films, like the iconic Scream, played with the conventions of the genre itself. They weren't just horror films, they were horror films about horror films. They were a self-conscious commentary on the genre, often utilizing irony and humor alongside the scares. The characters in these films were aware of the horror tropes, and they played upon the audience's expectations. The result was a thrilling mix of fear and laughter that kept viewers on the edge of their seats. And then came the found footage films. The idea was simple, yet terrifying. These films were crafted to appear as if they were real footage, discovered after horrific events. This created an intense, immersive experience that made it feel as if the horror was happening in the real world. The Blair Witch Project was a pioneer in this genre. It was marketed as a true story, and the shaky handheld camera footage added to the illusion of reality. Viewers were left wondering if they were watching a film or witnessing a real nightmare unfold. This film set the precedent for many found footage horror films to come. Paranormal Activity followed this trend, but with a twist. It used static home security footage to create a sense of dread and anticipation. The horror was subtle, often happening in the background or just off-screen. This made it all the more terrifying when the supernatural events finally happened. These two subgenres, meta-horror and found footage, pushed the boundaries of what horror could be. They played with our perception of reality and our understanding of the genre itself, creating a unique and terrifying experience. Now, let's take a look at where horror is today. The genre continues to evolve, with filmmakers finding new ways to scare us. But one thing is for sure, horror will always find a way to reflect our deepest fears and anxieties. In the 2010s and beyond, horror has become more diverse and innovative than ever. This era has seen a resurgence of the genre, with films that push boundaries and challenge our expectations. Take Get Out, for instance. This film, directed by Jordan Peele, shatters the typical horror mold, combining elements of social commentary with suspense and terror. It explores racial tensions in a way that's both horrifying and thought-provoking, proving that horror can be a powerful tool for exploring real-world issues. Then there's A Quiet Place, a film that turns the concept of sound, or rather the lack of it, into a weapon of terror. The movie, directed by John Krasinski, is a masterclass in tension building. It shows us how horror can thrive in silence, creating suspense not with screams, but with the deafening quiet. And let's not forget Hereditary, a film that delves into the realm of psychological horror. Directed by Ari Aster, it's a chilling exploration of family, grief, and mental illness. It's a layered, complex narrative that leaves you unsettled long after the credits roll. Looking ahead, the future of horror cinema is brighter than ever. The rise of streaming platforms has opened up new avenues for horror, allowing for more experimental and niche films to reach a wider audience. Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Hulu are just a few platforms that have become a breeding ground for innovative horror. And as technology continues to evolve, we might be on the cusp of a new era of horror, virtual reality. Imagine being immersed in a horror film, not just watching it, but experiencing it. The possibilities are both thrilling and terrifying. From Nosferatu to Netflix, horror cinema has always reflected our deepest fears and anxieties. As we look to the future, one thing is certain: horror is here to stay. So there you have it, a journey through the spine-chilling history of horror cinema. We've embarked on a thrilling expedition that began with the hair-raising silent films of the early 20th century. Those black and white flickers of terror set the stage for a genre that would continually push the boundaries of our deepest fears. From there, we moved to the golden age of Hollywood horror, where monsters like Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman became cultural icons. These were the classic tales of the supernatural that injected a dose of fright into the glamour of Hollywood. As we moved into the atomic age, the horror genre evolved to reflect societal fears. Monsters grew to colossal sizes, and psychological horror crept into the mainstream, making us question our own minds. The slasher films and body horrors of the 70s and 80s gave us iconic villains and gruesome effects. They showed us that our bodies weren't safe, and neither were our dreams. Then came the era of meta-horror and found footage, where the genre began to look inward and play with its own conventions. The line between reality and fiction blurred, and the audience became part of the horror. Finally, we discussed the contemporary horror landscape, filled with innovative techniques, diverse voices, and a focus on social commentary. It's an exciting time for horror cinema, and we can't wait to see where it goes next. Thank you for joining us on this terrifying journey. Remember, in horror cinema, the only thing to fear is fear itself.